It is a strange fate that we should suffer so much fear and doubt over so small a thing. Such a little thing, Boromir remarks in Peter Jackson's film adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring. How peculiar, he murmured, almost to himself, that something so small should cause such dread and uncertainty. Such a tiny thing, yet it holds the fate of us all. The equivalent passage from Ian Chesterfield's novelization, itself adapted from Jackson's film. These two presentations of the same moment illustrate how the adaptation of film into literature is never a direct translation. The cinematic Boromir's line is short, structured rhythmically, and the repetition and essence enhance its memorability. The novelized Boromir, however, is permitted a slower, more introspective expression. The added phrase, he murmured, almost to himself, signals a subtle shift. The line is not performative, but internal, a window into Boromir's growing unease. Though the core sentiment is unchanged, the delivery, tone, and detail vary significantly. These differences illuminate the strengths and constraints of film and prose as artistic mediums. To further explore these differences, this video will look at one part of the story in both the film and the novelization of The Fellowship of the Ring. First, we'll watch a short clip from the film. Then, we'll read the matching chapter from the novelization. Since films move quickly and can show a lot in just a few minutes, while novels often take pages to describe the same events, we'll break the novelization chapters into short passages. After each passage, we'll stop to talk about what works well in the novel, what might be stronger in the film, and how each version tells the story in its own way. We'll go back and forth like this until we've worked through the whole chapter. At the end, we'll wrap everything up by thinking about what each medium does best, where they might struggle, and how comparing them helps us understand the story in a new way. By the time we're finished, we'll have a much clearer idea of how storytelling changes when it moves from screen to page, and why that matters. Let's begin.
We must hold to this course west of the Misty Mountains for 40 days. If our luck holds, the Gap of Rohan will still be open to us. From there, our road turns east to Mordor. Ka-ting, ka-ting. 2, 1, 5. Good, very good. Ting, ting, ting. Move your feet. Quite good, Pippin. Thanks. Faster. 2, 1, run. If anyone were to ask me for my opinion, which I note they have not, I would say we're taking the long way round. Gandalf, we could pass through the mines of Moria. My cousin Balin would give us a royal welcome. No, Gimli. I would not take the road through Moria unless I had no other choice. Ka-ting, ka-ting, ka-ting. Yeah, sorry. Ooh, get him. For the Shire. Hold him. Mary, get off my arm. He's got my arm. What is that? Nothing, it's just a whiff of cloud. It's moving fast.
against the wind.
Crabine from Dunland! Hide! Hurry, hurry! Take cover!
Spies of Saruman, the passage south is being watched. We must take the pass of Caradhras.
Frodo? Oh.
Boromir. It is a strange fate that we should suffer so much fear and doubt over so small a thing. Such a little thing.
Boromir, give the ring to Frodo.
As you wish. I cannot. So, Gandalf, you try to lead them over Caradhras, and if that fails, where then will you go? If the mountain defeats you, will you risk a more dangerous road?
There is a foul voice on the air. It's Saruman! He's trying to bring down the mountain! Gandalf, we must turn back! We must get off the mountain! Make for the Gap of Rohan! And take the rest road to my city! The Gap of Rohan takes us too close to Isengard! We cannot pass over the mountain! Let us go under it! Let us go through the mines of Moria!
Moria. You fear to go into those mines. The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep. You know what they awoke in the darkness of Khazad-dûm? Shadow
and flame. Let the ring-bearer decide. Frodo.
We will go through the mines.
So be it.
Next, we'll read the first passage from the chapter of the novelization, and then compare and analyze the differences. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley of Rivendell as 9 figures made their way up the steep path that led out of the elven sanctuary. The companions climbed in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, as they left behind the last homely house east of the sea. Behind them, the elegant spires and waterfalls of Rivendell grew smaller, the sanctuary diminishing with each step they took toward the unknown. They were an unusual company, 4 hobbits, small in stature but resolute in spirit, a tall weathered ranger, a noble warrior from the south, an elf of ancient lineage, a sturdy bearded dwarf, and at their head an old man in grey robes, his staff tapping against the stony ground as he led them onward. This was the fellowship, bound together by a single purpose that weighed most heavily on the shoulders of the smallest among them. For days they journeyed through a landscape of deep valleys and turbulent waters. To their left, the misty mountains rose sharply against the sky, their peaks disappearing into the clouds. The terrain grew rougher, testing the endurance of the companions as they followed their guide.
We must maintain this course west of the Misty Mountain for 40 days,
the wizard Gandalf explained, during one of their brief rests. His aged face was etched with lines of concern as he traced their intended path on a worn map.
With fortune's favour, we'll find the Gap of Rohan still accessible. From there, our path turns eastward, toward Mordor.
The word hung in the air like a dark cloud. None needed reminding of what awaited them in that shadowed land. This opening passage from the novelization demonstrates some of the clearest strengths of prose over film, particularly in how it interiorizes the experiences of the journey and renders mood through language rather than visuals. Prose allows the writer to linger on atmosphere, to evoke feeling through the rhythm of the sentence and the accumulation of imagery. Phrases like, quote, "The elegant spires and waterfalls of Rivendell grew smaller," and "The word hung in the air like a dark cloud," end quote, are deeply subjective in tone, imbued with a sense of melancholy and foreboding that reflects the characters' inner states without having to state them explicitly. This subtlety of perspective is something prose can handle with great grace, since it doesn't need to externalize thought through performance, music, or visual framing. It can simply say what the characters are feeling, or imply it with precision. The prose here is also effective at establishing a sense of scale and solemnity. The description of the fellowship as, quote, "an unusual company," end quote, followed by the careful enumeration of its members, gives the reader both the diversity of the group and the symbolic significance of their unity. The landscape, harsh, ancient, uncaring, is painted with broad, almost mythic strokes that ground the reader in the epic genre. These long flowing sentences create a meditative pacing, reinforcing the sense of distance, time, and burden. However, this same quality can also be a limitation of the medium. The written word must tell us what a film can show in an instant. The line, quote, "His aged face was etched with lines of concern as he traced their intended path on a worn map," end quote, does a fine job of conveying Gandalf's worry, but it also slows the pace. In the film, a single shot carried the same information in a fraction of the time. The same goes for the long sentence that lists the Fellowship. While the structure has a certain grandeur, it lacks the immediate visual punch of a well-framed shot of the group setting out. Let's continue. Dawn broke over the Eregion hills, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. A small campfire burned at the center of their temporary encampment, where Sam tended to breakfast preparations. The sizzle of cooking food was nearly drowned out by the clashing of metal against metal. Several paces away, the man Boromir was instructing two of the hobbits in swordplay. Pippin danced awkwardly around with a short blade that seemed too large for his hands. "Keep your distance from the blade's edge," Boromir advised, his voice firm but patient. "Stay light on your feet." "Excellent. Very good." He circled the hobbit, adjusting his stance with a gentle nudge. "I want instinct, not deliberation." Sam looked up from his cooking with a wry smile. "That shouldn't be difficult for Pippin," he murmured, just loud enough for his friend Merry to hear. "Move those feet," Boromir continued, demonstrating a defensive stance. Merry, watching from nearby, gave an encouraging nod. "You're handling it well, Pip," he called out. Pippin beamed with pride. "I appreciate that." While the swordplay lesson continued, the dwarf Gimli had cornered Gandalf near a large boulder. His thick beard wagged as he spoke with conviction. "If my opinion carried any weight, which I notice it doesn't seem to, I'd suggest we're taking an unnecessary detour," Gimli grumbled, his eyes gleaming with stubborn determination. "Consider the mines of Moria as an alternative, Gandalf. My kinsman Balin would welcome us with the hospitality befitting royalty." A shadow passed over Gandalf's weathered face. He shook his head slowly, his eyes distant with unspoken memory. "That path is not one I would choose, Gimli, unless every other road were closed to us." The training session nearby took an unexpected turn when Boromir's practice thrust accidentally caught Pippin's hand. The hobbit yelped, dropping his blade. His face twisted in indignation before he launched himself at the much larger man, tackling him to the ground with surprising strength. Merry quickly joined the fray, and soon all three were rolling in the grass amidst bursts of laughter. Meanwhile, the elf Legolas had stepped away from the group, his keen eyes fixed on something in the distance, a dark smudge moving against the sky. shifting unnaturally against the wind currents. "What's that?" Sam asked, noticing the elf's intense gaze. Gimli barely glanced up.
"Nothing to concern ourselves with. Just a wisp of cloud."
"It's moving with purpose," Boromir observed as he disentangled himself from the hobbits, his voice taking on a note of concern. "And against the wind's direction." Legolas's posture stiffened.
Crabine from Dunland!
He called out, his melodious voice sharp with alarm.
Everyone, find cover!
Aragorn commanded, already moving to douse the fire.
Quickly now!
Boromir shouted, helping the hobbits gather their belongings.
Merry, Pippin, Sam, hide yourselves!
The company scrambled beneath whatever shelter they could find. Rocky outcroppings, bushes, anything that might conceal them from view. A great flock of large crow-like birds swept overhead, their formation too deliberate to be natural. The birds circled, once, twice, their harsh cries echoing across the hills, before wheeling away southward as one. When they had passed beyond sight, Gandalf emerged from hiding, his face grim as he leaned heavily on his staff.
Saruman's eyes,
he muttered, his voice tinged with disappointment and resolve.
The southern passage is under watch.
He exchanged a meaningful glance with Aragorn before turning to address the others, pointing toward a snow-capped mountain peak that loomed in the distance.
We have no choice now,
Gandalf declared.
We must attempt the pass of Caradhras.
This passage continues to showcase the unique strengths of prose, especially its ability to weave multiple narrative threads into a coherent and textured moment. In a single scene, the reader is given access to tone, character interaction, subtle humor, shifting dynamics, and an undercurrent of dread, all through precise language and control over pacing. Unlike film, which tends to focus the viewer's attention through camera work, editing, and sound effects, prose is free to jump between focal points. Sam's cooking, Boromir's swordplay instruction, Gimli's complaints, Legolas's vigilance, without cutting away or losing cohesion. This mosaic-like structure is one of prose's great strengths. It gives the reader a panoramic sense of group activity, while still offering insight into individual characters' voices and concerns. The prose here also excels at characterization through dialogue and gesture. Boromir's instructive but gentle demeanor is revealed not just through his words, but through physical actions, circling Pippin, nudging his stance, offering praise without condescension. Gimli's gruffness is given comic edge. Quote, his beard wagged as he spoke with conviction. End quote. A line that would have been hard to convey in the film without feeling too on the nose or reliant on a certain acting style. Sam's dry wit comes through quietly, and Pippin's mix of clumsiness and pride is portrayed with empathy. These internal textures, the tones, the glances, the little thoughts, and wry asides are prose's natural terrain.
They emerge not from performance or shot composition, but from word choice, cadence, and narrative flow. However, the limitations of prose compared to film are still apparent. The moment the Crabine appear in the sky is described with vivid detail, but the sheer visual and auditory intensity of that moment was arguably more powerfully conveyed in the film. The sudden rustling of wings, the sharp cries overhead, the quick scramble into hiding. In prose, even a, quote, great flock of large crow-like birds, end quote, lacks the visceral immediacy a camera can provide. The tension is real, but it is evoked through language, which requires time and interpretation. The image is painted for the mind's eye, not directly perceived, and therefore relies on the reader's imaginative participation. Let's continue.
The mountain air grew thin and bitter as the fellowship climbed higher along the treacherous path of Caradhras. Snow crunched beneath their feet, the white powder growing deeper with each step upward. The hobbits struggled the most, their small frames not built for such harsh conditions. Frodo lagged slightly behind Gandalf. His foot caught on a loose stone, sending him tumbling backward down the slope. Aragorn quickly caught and steadied him, but as Frodo regained his footing, his hand flew to his neck. His eyes widened in panic. The chain that held the One Ring was no longer there. Several paces back, the golden band gleamed against the pristine snow, like a drop of captured sunlight. Boromir noticed it first. He stopped and stooped to retrieve it, lifting the ring by its delicate chain. As the golden circle dangled before his eyes, something in his expression changed. A subtle shift, as though he were seeing something wonderful and terrible all at once.
Boromir,
Aragorn called, his voice low, but carrying a note of warning. The man from Gondor did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the ring, as it spun slowly on its chain, catching the harsh mountain light. "How peculiar," he murmured, almost to himself, "that something so small should cause such dread and uncertainty. Such a tiny thing, yet it holds the fate of us all." Aragorn approached cautiously, his hand drifting toward the hilt of his sword.
Boromir,
he said again, his voice firmer now.
Return the ring to Frodo.
For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Boromir stood transfixed. A strange smile slowly spread across his face, his eyes reflecting the golden gleam of the ring. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the spell broke. He blinked, and the man of Gondor returned. "Of course," he said lightly, extending the chain toward Frodo. "I have no interest in it." He handed the ring back to the hobbit, tousling Frodo's dark curls with forced casualness. Aragorn's hand slowly moved away from his sword, but his eyes remained watchful. This passage is a prime example of prose's ability to explore psychological nuance and interior tension in ways that film often cannot, without external devices like close-ups, music cues, or actor expression. In prose,
the inner tremors of a character, the barely perceptible shift from self-control to temptation can be slowed down, made explicit, or subtly implied, and drawn out for the reader to sit with. The moment Boromir picks up the ring is not simply an event, it becomes a slow unraveling of character under pressure. The narrative lens lingers on his facial expression, the cadence of his thoughts, the way the ring's glow catches in his eyes. These observations guide the reader toward an understanding of what's happening internally, not just what is visible. The strength of this medium lies in how it frames these psychological beats through suggestion. Boromir's fascination, quote, something wonderful and terrible all at once, end quote, is not declared as a dramatic shift, but described in terms that let the reader intuit the growing pull of the ring. The prose carries a kind of gravity here, drawing us into the moral precariousness of the scene, amplifying the threat through pace and implication rather than spectacle. That he murmurs to himself and then smiles oddly before snapping out of it, all these details create a textured portrayal of someone slipping briefly into enchantment and shame. It's subtle, and that subtlety is where prose often excels. Still, where prose leans heavily into emotional and symbolic depth, it may lack immediacy. The film version of this scene delivered visceral urgency in a heartbeat. The stumble, the catch, the sudden gleam of gold. Sound design, facial tension, the crackle of cold wind, all were deployed in seconds to pull the audience in. The film also chose to leave Boromir's intent more ambiguous. Prose, on the other hand, often must commit to an interpretive stance, and while this adds clarity, it sometimes removes the ambiguity that makes a moment feel more alive or unsettling. Let's continue.
In Isengard, far to the south, the once green valley had been transformed into a landscape of industry and destruction. Where trees had stood for centuries, now smouldering pits and wooden scaffolding scarred the earth. Hundreds of orcs moved like ants through the complex, labouring over forges and strange writhing sacks that pulsed with unnatural life. Upon a wooden platform overlooking this scene of devastation stood Saruman the White, once the head of the Wizards' Council, now a servant of darker powers. He raised his face to the sky as the returning Crabine circled and cawed their report.
So, Gandalf,
Saruman spoke to the wind, as if his former friend could hear him across the leagues.
You attempt to lead them over Caradhras.
A cold smile played at his lips.
And when that path fails, where will you turn?
He extended his arms, his white robes billowing as he began to chant words of power. The wind answered his call, gathering clouds from all directions toward the distant mountains.
If the mountain defeats you,
he continued, his voice rising with the strengthening wind,
will you risk a more dangerous road?
The blizzard struck with unnatural fury. The fellowship struggled forward through snow that reached the chests of the hobbits, who were now being carried by the taller members of the company. Legolas alone moved easily, his light elven steps carrying him atop the snow's crust, while the others floundered beneath. The elf paused suddenly, his keen ears catching what the others could not yet hear. "Listen," he called back, his fair face troubled. "There's a malevolent voice carried on the wind." Gandalf, snow clinging to his beard and hat, raised his head.
"Saruman!"
he growled, recognition and anger flashing in his eyes. Thunder rumbled overhead, shaking loose stones and ice from the mountain face above them. The path ahead grew more treacherous with each passing moment.
"He's using his power against the mountain!"
Aragorn shouted over the howling gale.
"Gandalf, we cannot continue this way!" "We must!"
the wizard insisted, pushing forward against the driving snow. Raising his gnarled staff toward the darkened sky, Gandalf began to chant words of ancient power, his voice rising to challenge the storm.
"Lost o Caradhras, Sid ho hoda, Nuathu Iaruth,"
he called to the mountain itself.
"Sleep, Caradhras, be still, lie still, hold your wrath."
Far away in Isengard, Saruman stood atop the tower of Orthanc, his own incantations growing in strength as clouds swirled at his command. The power of the two wizards clashed in the heights of Caradhras. A blinding flash of lightning struck the mountainside above the Fellowship, followed by a deafening crack. Frodo looked up in horror as an avalanche of snow and rock cascaded toward them. The companions pressed themselves against the cliff face as the deluge of white crashed onto the narrow ledge where they stood. For several terrifying moments, the world was nothing but cold and darkness. Then, gradually, movement stirred beneath the snow as Aragorn and Boromir dug frantically for the buried hobbits. One by one, they pulled them free, shivering, frightened, but alive.
"This path will be our doom,"
Boromir declared, sheltering Merry and Pippin against the continuing storm.
"We must abandon it, make for the Gap of Rohan instead, and then westward toward my city."
Aragorn shook his head, snow falling from his dark hair.
"The Gap of Rohan lies too near to Isengard. We would be walking into Saruman's grasp." "The mountain has defeated us,"
Gimli stated flatly, his beard crusted with ice.
"Let us go beneath it instead, through the mines of Moria."
At the mention of Moria, a troubled expression crossed Gandalf's face. In his mind, he could almost hear Saruman's mocking voice.
"Moria. You fear those mines, don't you, Gandalf? The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep. You know what they awoke in the darkness of Khazad-dûm? Shadow and flame."
The wizard turned to Frodo, his eyes heavy with the burden of foresight and memory.
"Let the ring-bearer decide our course,"
he said quietly. All eyes turned toward Frodo. The young hobbit stood small against the vastness of the mountain, the weight of the decision bearing down on him as heavily as the snow. He looked at Merry and Pippin, shivering violently despite Boromir's protection, their faces pale with cold.
"Frodo,"
Gandalf prompted gently. Frodo met the wizard's gaze, sensing the reluctance behind the question. Nevertheless, his decision was clear.
"We will go through the mines,"
he said. Gandalf's face was solemn, as he nodded slowly.
So be it.
This final passage vividly demonstrates how prose can operate at both an epic and intimate scale simultaneously, a quality film often struggles to balance without splitting its focus or shifting tone abruptly. Here, the author leverages the medium's full capacity for narrative control, pulling the reader from the industrial devastation of Isengard to the supernatural confrontation atop Caradhras, then plunging into the claustrophobic fear of an avalanche, and finally settling on the internal weight of a single character's decision. All this is accomplished without the need for cutting, sound effects, or shifting visual effects. Instead, it flows through language alone, and in doing so, prose maintains a coherence of theme and mood that the film might have sacrificed for visual pacing or spectacle. The strength of this passage lies in its ability to explore competing forces, will, nature, and destiny, while illuminating each character's response to crisis. Saruman's manipulations are rendered not just as villainous gestures, but as extensions of his pride and bitterness. His rhetorical question, quote, "And when that path fails, where will you turn?" end quote, is not just exposition, it's a taunt, and prose allows it to echo through the scene as an almost mythic challenge. The narrative can afford to step inside his mind and linger on the image of him standing atop Orthanc, white robes flaring, commanding the storm. In the film, this was undeniably a powerful image, but the text adds intention, history, and voice to what otherwise was just an impressive shot. Still, the limitations of the medium surface in the storm and avalanche sequence. While well rendered in text, the sheer kinetic terror of that moment, the rumble of snow, the blinding whiteout, the moment of burial, the sheer kinetic terror of that moment hit harder in the film. The immediacy of physical danger, the rapid escalation, the panic on faces. These are things cinema excels at, whereas prose must slow down to describe them, and in doing so can sometimes blunt their edge. It only works here because the focus is not purely on the action, but on what the action means. The failure of a chosen path, the rise of magical opposition, and the increasing cost of the journey. Yet it lacks the visceral punch a well-directed sequence could provide. In summary, this chapter plays to the deepest strengths of prose: psychological interiority, thematic layering, narrative breadth, and tonal control. Where the film leaned into spectacle, the novel embraces voice, metaphor, and pacing to communicate dread,
Prose does not merely recount events, it inhabits them. And in doing so, it gives the reader not just a view of the story, but a seat at its emotional and moral center. Thank you for watching this comparative analysis. Next time, we'll be comparing the scene where the Fellowship journeys to the mines of Moria with the corresponding chapter in the novelization and analyzing the differences. Take care, and if you're listening to this, please send help.